The cursed town of Harlan, the macabre secret buried deep within the Appalachian Mountains. But before this mysterious story unfolds, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? What city, and what time is it there? It truly means the world to us to know how far our stories are reaching. Drop it in the comments below. The mountains of eastern Kentucky did not welcome strangers. They endured them, absorbed them into the fog, the cold dust, and the particular silence of hollows where sound perished before it could travel. But welcome them, they did not. The old-timers understood this well. Born inside that silence, they had grown up reading ridge lines the way other men read weather vanes, and they carried within their bones a knowledge that no amount of money or ambition could ever buy, that Black Mountain gave nothing without a price, and that everything taken from it carried a cost no company contract ever printed. They knew this. And still the men came. The Holbrook property sat 7 miles east of Harlan Center, at the end of a dirt road the county had never bothered to grade or maintain. The house itself, a 3-story federal-style structure built in 1847, its white paint faded to gray by decades of mountain weather, could only be glimpsed from the road in winter, when the oak and hickory trees shed enough leaves to allow a partial view. Come spring and summer, the property vanished entirely behind a wall of green, as though the mountain itself had chosen to keep it private. Ray Dunford knew about the house because his foreman's assistant, a local man named Gibbs Cordell, a distant relation to one of the 4 families, though he never elaborated on precisely how distant, had once let it slip during a conversation he clearly regretted starting. Ray had filed the information away with the patient instinct of a man who understood that in a town like Harlan, the things people refused to discuss were invariably the things most worth knowing. He shared what he'd gathered with Thomas on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after Thomas's discovery in the lower shaft. Thomas had said nothing about the sealed passage in those 3 weeks. He had returned to his routine, watching, listening, waiting, with the same quiet discipline that had carried him through 2 failed harvests and a cross-state move with $11. But those 4 words scratched into rock had not left him. They lived in the back of his mind the way a splinter lives beneath skin. Not always painful, but never absent. When Ray began talking about the families, Thomas listened with something more than casual interest. 4 families. 1 mountain. Elias Holbrook had come to Harlan County in 1831, a land surveyor out of Richmond, Virginia, carrying a government contract and an eye for mineral deposits that his official duties conveniently allowed him to locate and quietly acquire. Within 5 years, through a combination of legitimate transactions and arrangements the historical record described only in vague terms, he had secured the mineral rights to nearly 40% of Black Mountain's eastern face. The Warfield family arrived a decade later, their wealth rooted in timber. Augustus Warfield had stripped the lower ridges of Black Mountain with industrial efficiency throughout the 1840s and 1850s, replanting nothing, and had used those proceeds to purchase mineral rights adjacent to the Holbrook holdings. Recognizing a mutual advantage, the 2 families formalized their arrangement through a business partnership in 1857 and through marriage in 1863, when Elias Holbrook's granddaughter wed Augustus Warfield's eldest son. The Cordells and the Dunns were older Harlan County families, Scotch-Irish settlers whose roots in the region predated any formal land ownership system, who had simply been there when the surveys arrived and had been shrewd enough to ensure their presence was translated into documentation. The Cordells held the western mineral rights. The Dunns held the water rights to the 3 creeks draining Black Mountain's northern slope, a detail that would prove, in time, to be the most consequential property holding among all 4 families. By 1890, the 4 families together controlled access to the most productive coal seams in eastern Kentucky. When the Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company was incorporated in 1901, its founding documents listed all 4 families as principal stakeholders. The company's president was a Cincinnati businessman named Howard Fitch. But everyone in Harlan County understood that Howard Fitch was an administrator. The owners were the families. What changed in 1908? Ray had assembled this history from courthouse records, From conversations with older Harlan residents, and from one remarkable source, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Alma Pig, 71 years old, who had taught in Harlan County since 1879, and who, in the unsentimental manner of very old women who have outlived most of the people they were meant to protect, was willing to speak about things that younger residents would not. Miss Alma lived on Ivy Street in a house so crowded with books and stacked newspapers that moving through it required single-file navigation along narrow channels between the piles. Ray had met her through a church social and recognized immediately that she was the most informed person in Harlan County, and that she, at 71, was fully aware her information would die with her unless she gave it away. The families left town in 1908 and 1909, Miss Alma had told Ray, seated in the one chair in her parlor not occupied by periodicals. All four of them, within 18 months of each other. The Holbrooks went first, in the spring of 1908. The Warfields that fall. The Cordells and Dunns the following year. What happened in 1908? Ray had asked. Miss Alma had looked at him with the measured patience of a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children to think before they spoke. In March of 1908, she said, 11 men died in Shaft 7 of the Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company. Official cause, a gas explosion. The mine inspector's report, which she had read, described the explosion as consistent with accumulated methane and a lamp malfunction. But, Ray said. But Shaft 7 had operated for 4 years without a single gas incident. The ventilation was considered exemplary. The foreman, a man named George Blevins, had an impeccable safety record. And the 11 men who died were not distributed randomly throughout the shaft. They were all working in the same section. She paused. The north section, she said. The information reaches Thomas and Ray. Ray told Thomas everything that Saturday evening, speaking quietly on the boarding house porch while the rest of Harlan's weekend noise moved along Central Street below them. Thomas listened without interruption. When Ray finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. 11 men, Thomas said finally. In one section, Ray confirmed. The north section of Shaft 7, which, according to the shaft diagrams Ray had found in the county surveyor's office, would have been directly below and to the east of the north tunnel. Thomas said it before Ray could. Ray looked at him. You know something. Thomas told him about the sealed passage. About the 4 words above the stone wall. He had not intended to tell anyone, but Ray's information had shifted the geometry of things entirely. The sealed passage was no longer merely a curiosity. It was connected to something. 11 dead men. For families who had left town within 18 months of those deaths. A warning scratched into rock by someone who had known, or suspected, what lay on the other side. Ray was quiet for a long time after Thomas finished. We need to talk to Pete Sorrell, Ray said. Pete doesn't talk, Thomas replied. Pete doesn't talk to men he doesn't trust, Ray said. That's a different thing. Pete Sorrell speaks. They found Pete on a Sunday afternoon at his rented room above the hardware store on Cumberland Avenue. He answered the door in his undershirt, looked at both of them with those creekwater eyes, and stepped aside without a word. The room was spare, a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with 4 books, and a Bible. Pete listened while Thomas described the sealed passage, and while Ray laid out Miss Alma's account of the 1908 explosion. He listened without expression, seated at the table with his hands flat on the surface, the way a man sits when he is managing something internal and does not want it visible. When they finished, Pete was silent for nearly a full minute. My uncle worked Shaft 7, he said at last. He wasn't one of the 11. He was ill that week, influenza, and they'd sent him home 2 days before it happened. He lived to be 78 years old. And he never once spoke about what happened in that shaft. Not once. I asked him when I was young, and he looked at me as though I had spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Did he know what was in the north section? Thomas asked. Pete looked at his hands. He knew what they were told to do in the north section. Pete said he'd told him that much, once, when he was very old and had likely decided it no longer mattered what he said. What were they told to do? Ray asked. Pete looked up. Remove what they found, he said. And never describe what it was. Not to their foreman, not to their wives, not to a priest. Load it into crates. Seal the crates. Bring them to the surface. The crates were picked up by men they didn't recognize and taken in wagons toward the Dunn property on the North Creek. The room was very quiet. What was in the crates? Thomas asked. Pete shook his head slowly. My uncle didn't know. He said the men who worked that section came out different after a few weeks. Quieter. He said one man, a fellow named Haskins, started having episodes. Shaking, confusion, couldn't remember where he was. The company doctor said it was nerves. Haskins was let go in January of 1908. 2 months before the explosion, Ray said. 2 months before the explosion, Pete confirmed. He stood then, which Thomas understood as the end of the conversation. At the door, Pete stopped and turned back. I've worked this mountain for 31 years, he said. I have never filed a complaint, never caused trouble, never asked a question I wasn't supposed to ask. I'm not telling you this because I'm proud of it. I'm telling you so you understand what I mean when I say what I'm about to say. He looked directly at Thomas. Whatever is behind that wall, whatever the Dunns picked up in those wagons and carried to their property on the North Creek, it was worth more to those 4 families than 11 men's lives. And those families have been in this county for 80 years, and their reach is longer than you can measure. They are watching this mountain the same way they always have. He opened the door. Be careful what you go looking for, Pete said. Because in my experience in this county, the men who find things are the men who disappear. The letter Thomas didn't send. That night, Thomas sat at his desk and began a letter to Elenina. He wrote 3 sentences, then stopped. He read what he had written. Then he folded the paper and put it in the drawer without sending it. He didn't yet know what was behind the sealed wall in Shaft 4. He didn't know what the Dunn family had transported in those crates in 1908, or why 11 men had died, or what connection existed between those deaths and the 4 families' sudden retreat from public life. But he understood now that he was not dealing with a curiosity or a minor company secret. He was standing at the edge of something with real depth, in a county where the men who controlled the ground beneath his feet had demonstrated, 15 years ago, that they were capable of deciding what a man's life was worth against whatever they were protecting. Thomas looked at the photograph of Elenina and Ruth on the desk beside the lamp. He thought about 11 men in a north section. About crates loaded in the dark. About a retired schoolteacher with a house full of newspapers who had kept this information alive for 15 years because she understood that someone would eventually need to know it. He opened the drawer and retrieved the unfinished letter. He added one line. Elenina, if you don't hear from me for more than 2 weeks, go to my brother James in Wise County and stay there until I write. He sealed it. He mailed it the following morning. The deed and what it described. The county recorder's office occupied a single room on the ground floor of the Harlan County Courthouse, a building that smelled permanently of coal dust, old paper, and the particular damp that accumulates in stone structures built too close to creek beds. The recorder himself, a thin man named Alton Ceasemore, was present on weekday mornings and absent on weekday afternoons with a consistency that suggested a private arrangement with himself about how much of his life the county was entitled to claim. Ray Dunford went on a Wednesday morning, when Alton was present and when foot traffic through the courthouse was light enough that a man could spend an hour with the deed records without drawing attention. He was looking for the Dunn property on the North Creek. What he found was considerably more than he had anticipated. The Dunn family had acquired their North Creek property in 3 separate transactions between 1847 and 1861, assembling a contiguous parcel of approximately 340 acres along Black Mountain's northern drainage. The deed descriptions were standard for the period, meets and bounds surveying, reference points identified by trees and rock formations, the language of men measuring land with chains and compasses in dense forest, except for one clause in the 1861 deed, recorded when Nathaniel Dunn transferred the property to his son Robert as part of an estate settlement. Ray copied it word for word into his notebook. Including and especially the subterranean formations known to the grantor, comprising those passages and chambers accessed from the northern drainage, which the grantor has caused to be secured and which the grantee is hereby instructed to maintain in a secured condition, the contents thereof to remain undisturbed and unexamined by any party not previously authorized in writing by the principal families of record. Said authorization to require agreement of no fewer than 3 of the 4 principal families, the whole of this provision to remain in effect in perpetuity and to bind all heirs and assigns. Ray read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the water-stained ceiling of the recorder's office for a long moment. Subterranean formations. Passages and chambers. Contents to remain undisturbed. Written in 1861. 62 years ago. Whatever lay beneath the Dunn property on the North Creek had been secured, protected, and legally entailed to future generations for more than 6 decades. The 4 families had built a formal legal structure around it, written it into property law. And 11 men had died, Ray was now certain, because they had gotten too close to it from the other direction. From inside the mountain, through the north tunnel of Shaft 7. He closed the deed book carefully, returned it to its shelf, and walked out of the courthouse into the cold March air. Miss Alma again. Ray went back to Miss Alma Pig that same afternoon. She was in her parlor reading, and she looked up when he entered with an expression suggesting she had expected his return and had simply been waiting to see how long it would take. Ray showed her the deed language he had copied. Miss Alma read it once, set the notebook on her knee, and looked out the window at the bare maple in her front yard. "I wondered if that document still existed," she said quietly. "You knew about it?" Ray asked. "I knew what it referred to," she said. "Not from reading it. From a conversation I had in 1909, about 6 months after the Warfields left town." She was quiet for a moment, organizing her words with the care of a woman who had been precise about language for 50 years. "There was a man named Foster Dunning," she said. "No relation to the Dunn family, different spelling entirely. He was a surveyor retained by the coal company in 1906 to map the deeper sections of Black Mountain for potential new shaft locations. He was thorough and honest, which in retrospect made him poorly suited for the assignment." "What did he find?" Ray asked. "He found that the northern drainage of Black Mountain was not simply a series of natural passages. He found evidence of human activity, very old human activity, pre-settlement. He found chambers that had been used. How and by whom, he could not determine with certainty. He found material he described in his survey notes as artifacts of considerable age and apparent cultural significance." She paused. "He submitted his survey to the company in December of 1906. He was paid and thanked. In January of 1907, the company retained a second surveyor, a man from Louisville with no prior connection to Harlan County, to produce a revised survey. The revised survey made no mention of the northern chambers." "And Dunning?" Ray asked. "Foster Dunning left Harlan County in February of 1907, Miss Alma said. He took a position with a land company in Lexington. He wrote me one letter in March of that year. We had been friendly. He had borrowed books from me during his time here, which is generally sufficient basis for a correspondence. She reached into the stack of papers beside her chair with the practiced ease of a woman who knew precisely where everything was despite appearances. She produced a yellowed envelope and handed it to Ray. "You may read it," she said. "He's gone now, passed in 1918. I believe the confidentiality he requested has expired." Foster Dunning's letter. The letter was dated March 14, 1907. The handwriting was small and precise. "Dear Miss Pig, I write to you because you are among the few people I encountered in Harlan County whose discretion I trust entirely, and because I find I cannot carry what I know without sharing it with someone who will understand its significance. What I found in the northern passages of Black Mountain is not something I am able to describe fully in a letter, for reasons that will become clear. But I will say this: the chambers I surveyed in the fall of 1906 contain material evidence of sustained human occupation over a very long period. Based on the stratigraphy and the condition of the artifacts, I would estimate the occupation spanned several centuries at minimum, and possibly considerably longer. The artifacts include tools, structural modifications to the natural cave formations, and a quantity of material I can only describe as records. Not written records in any alphabet I recognize, but systematic markings on prepared surfaces that indicate deliberate information storage. The chambers have been known to the Dunn family since at least the early 19th century. I found evidence of more recent disturbance, within the last 50 years, consistent with careful, systematic removal of selected materials. Someone has been taking things out of those chambers for decades. I was asked politely, but with unmistakable firmness, to revise my survey findings. I was told the northern passages were a private matter and that my professional discretion was both expected and, it was implied, financially compensable. I accepted the revised terms because I have a wife and 2 children, and because the men who spoke to me were not the kind one refuses without consequences. I am not proud of this. I record it here because I believe what is in those chambers belongs to no family and to no company. I believe it is significant beyond anything that can be measured in mineral rights or property deeds. And I believe the men who currently control access to it understand this, which is precisely why they guard it so carefully. I do not know what will happen when the mining operations eventually reach the northern section from below. I suspect the families know this is coming, and I suspect they have plans to manage it. I hope those plans do not involve the men who will be doing the work. With respect and gratitude for your friendship. Foster Dunning. Ray set the letter down. The recorder's office. The courthouse. Harlan's ordinary noise outside. All of it felt suddenly very far away. He hoped the plans didn't involve the men doing the work, Ray said. Yes, Miss Alma said. And then 11 men died in Shaft 7 in March of 1908. Yes, Miss Alma said again. Her voice was even. She had had 15 years to sit with this. Why didn't you go to anyone with this? Ray asked. The letter, the deed language. Why didn't you? Go to whom? Miss Alma said, not unkindly. The county sheriff was on a first-name basis with Robert Dunn. The state mine inspector filed a report describing the 1908 explosion as an accident, and she had no evidence to technically contradict that finding. Only evidence of motive and context. The newspapers in this region were owned by men who understood where their interests lay. She looked at Ray steadily. I am a 71-year-old schoolteacher in a cold town in eastern Kentucky, she said. I have kept this information alive because I believed that eventually someone would come along who could do something with it that I cannot. I have been waiting 15 years. What do you think should be done? Ray asked. I think someone should go to the North Creek, Miss Alma said simply. I think someone should see what the Dunns have been removing from those chambers and storing on their property. And I think someone should document it in a form that cannot be suppressed, with photographs, with witnesses, with copies sent to institutions the Holbrooks and Warfields and Cordells and Dunns cannot reach. She picked up her book, which Ray understood as the end of the conversation. "I think you already know this," she added, without looking up. "I think you came here today to hear someone else say it." Thomas makes a decision. Ray brought everything to Thomas that evening. The deed language, the letter, the full account of Miss Alma's conversation. He spread it across the small table in Thomas's room at Mrs. Combs's boarding house, the lamp turned up high, the window fogged with cold. Thomas read Foster Dunning's letter twice. He sat with it for a long time. "Artifacts," Thomas said. "Chambers. Markings on surfaces." "Something old," Ray said. "Something significant enough that 4 of the most powerful families in this county have been protecting it for at least 60 years, and killing men to keep it hidden." "We don't know they killed those men," Thomas said carefully. 11 men died in the section of the mine closest to those chambers, 2 months after one of the workers from that section had a breakdown and was dismissed, Ray said. "We don't have proof. But we have a sequence." Thomas was quiet. Outside, fog had come down early from Black Mountain, thick and gray, wrapping the street below in silence. He thought about Elenina's last letter. About Ruth, who was 7 years old and learning to read. About the $11 he'd arrived with, the money he'd been sending home, the careful, modest plan to bring his family to Harlan by summer and build something stable on what the mountain paid. He thought about Foster Dunning, who had a wife and 2 children, who had made what he called the practical choice, and who had spent the rest of his life writing letters confessing to it. "The Dunn property," Thomas said. "How far?" 7 miles north, Ray said. "Along the creek road. There's a structure on the property, an old stone building near the creek. I found a reference to it in the county tax records. Listed as a storage facility, built 1871. 1871, Thomas repeated. 10 years after the deed language requiring the contents to be secured. They built something to house whatever they brought out of the mountain, Ray said. And they've been adding to it for 60 years. Thomas looked at the photograph of Elenina and Ruth. "We go on Sunday," he said. "Before dawn. We look. We don't touch anything. We document what we can." Ray nodded. "And Pete?" Ray asked. Thomas considered. "Pete told us to be careful," he said. "He didn't tell us to stop." He folded Foster Dunning's letter and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he turned the lamp down, and the room went dark except for the gray light through the fogged window and the distant glow of Harlan's street lamps below. Somewhere up the mountain, behind a wall of mortared stone in the lowest section of Shaft 4, the north tunnel waited in the dark. And 7 miles away on the North Creek, a stone building erected in 1871 held 60 years of secrets that 4 families had decided were worth more than the men who discovered them. Thomas had made his decision. What happened next would depend on what they found, and on whether the families were still watching as carefully as Pete Sorrell believed. It was the year 1923, and Harlan County was alive in a way that felt almost violent. The coal boom had transformed what was once a scatter of Appalachian homesteads into a city with ambition, brick storefronts lining Central Street, a proper bank with a granite facade, 2 hotels that filled every Monday with new arrivals, a church whose bell tower rose high enough above the rooftops to catch the first light before the rest of the town stirred. The population had tripled in under a decade. Men had come from Virginia, from West Virginia, from as far south as Alabama, drawn by the promise of steady wages and the particular species of hope that only desperation can manufacture. Thomas Aldridge was one of them. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that told his entire biography, calloused from years of farm work in Wise County, Virginia, scarred across the left palm from a fence wire accident at 19. He stepped off the Louisville and Nashville Railroad car on a Tuesday morning in March carrying a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, a photograph of his wife Elenina and their daughter Ruth, and $11. The last of everything, after drought had taken the second harvest in a row. Thomas was not a dreamer. He was a man who had learned through sustained and patient suffering that hope was a luxury best kept small. He did not arrive in Harlan expecting prosperity. He arrived expecting survival. The hiring office. The Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company occupied a two-story brick building at the corner of Central and Mine Street, its entrance worn smooth by the boots of thousands of men who had stood where Thomas now stood, hat in hand, waiting to be measured. The hiring manager, a heavy-set man named Cecil Pratt, looked Thomas up and down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had assessed thousands of bodies for their usefulness in underground spaces. "You claustrophobic?" Cecil asked, not looking up from his ledger. "No, sir," Thomas said. "You got a problem taking orders from a foreman, even when those orders don't make sense to you?" Thomas hesitated. Just half a second. Cecil caught it. "Every man hesitates on that one," Cecil said, finally looking up. "The honest ones do, anyway." "Good. I'll take honest over agreeable any day. Sign here." Thomas signed. He was assigned to shaft number 4, starting the following Monday. $3.20 a day, 6 days a week, more money than he had made in any single month of farming. That night, in the boarding house on Mound Street run by a widow named Mrs. Dora Combs, Thomas wrote a letter to Ella by lamplight. "The work is hard, but the pay is real," he wrote. "I think we made the right decision. I think this place might be the answer." He sealed the envelope. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it was thin and unrestful, the kind of sleep that leaves a man more tired than when he began. The mine and the men. Shaft number 4 descended at a 30-degree angle into the base of Black Mountain, the highest peak in Kentucky, its summit perpetually wrapped in cloud. The entrance was narrow enough that 2 men could walk side by side, but only barely, and it widened gradually as it deepened, branching into a network of tunnels that the experienced miners navigated with the casual confidence of men who had made their peace with darkness. Thomas's crew consisted of 6 men. Junior Bates, 24, wiry and perpetually cheerful in the unsettling way of someone who had simply stopped calculating risk. Odell Maynard, 47, a Harlan native who had worked this mountain since he was 16 and who spoke about the mine the way a man speaks about a difficult relative, with familiarity and unresolved tension. Calvin Price, a black man from Middlesboro who kept to himself during breaks but worked with a focus and precision that foreman Walt Gregg acknowledged only through silence, the particular silence of a man who respects competence but has no vocabulary for saying so. And then there was Pete Sorrell. Pete was 53, the oldest man on the crew, with a gray beard and eyes the color of creek water in winter. He had been born in Harlan County. His father had worked this mountain. His grandfather had logged the ridges above it. Pete carried knowledge about this place that no company survey had ever recorded. And in Thomas's first week, he said almost nothing. It was on the 5th day, a Friday, cold enough that breath clouded even inside the shaft, that Pete leaned toward Thomas during their lunch break and spoke in a voice low enough that only Thomas could hear. "You notice they never give us work orders for the North Tunnel," Pete said. Thomas looked up from his biscuit. "What North Tunnel?" he asked. Pete chewed slowly. "Exactly," he said, and returned to his food. What the town knew and would not say. In the evenings, Central Street filled with the energy particular to mining towns at shift's end, men moving through cold dust and cold air toward boarding houses and the 2 establishments that served alcohol under the legal fiction of being pharmacies. There was laughter, occasionally a fight, the smell of fried food and damp wool, and the specific exhaustion that lives in the shoulders of men who spend their days underground. Thomas fell into a routine. Work, eat, write to Ella, sleep. He sent money home every 2 weeks. Ella wrote back in careful, economical letters, reporting on Ruth's health, the garden, the price of flour. Between the lines, Thomas read what she did not write. Hurry up and bring us there, or hurry up and come home. He made one genuine friend. Ray Dunford, who worked shaft 2 and lived 2 rooms down at Mrs. Combs's boarding house. Ray was from Knoxville, educated enough to have read several books and opinionated enough to have views on all of them. He was the kind of man who made a difficult place bearable by making it interesting. It was Ray who first mentioned the families. "You know who actually runs this town?" Ray said one evening, the two of them on the boarding house porch. "Not the coal company. Not the mayor. The Consolidated is just the machinery. The real engine is 4 families who've been here since before the Civil War. The Holbrooks, the Warfields, the Cordells, and the Dunns." "Landowners?" Thomas asked. "Landowners, yes, but more than that. Those 4 families own the mineral rights to most of Black Mountain. The coal company leases from them. Every dollar that comes out of that mountain passes through their hands first." Thomas considered this. It was not surprising. "So they're rich," he said. "Rich is one word," Ray replied. He was quiet for a moment. "What's strange is that none of them live in town anymore. Used to, but about 15 years ago, all 4 families moved out to their country properties within roughly 2 years of each other." "Why?" Ray picked at a loose thread on his jacket. "Nobody seems to know. Or nobody seems to want to say." The passage. On his 3rd week, Thomas was assigned to inspect the support timbers in the lower sections of Shaft 4. A solitary task requiring methodical attention, and one that generated the kind of deep quiet Thomas unexpectedly found almost peaceful. He was working in the lowest section, lantern casting long shadows across coal-black walls, when he stopped. A passage branched off to the left at an angle he had not seen on any shaft diagram. The timbers framing it were far older than those in the main shaft, almost petrified, darkened by decades of moisture and pressure. Someone had framed that passage with care and considerable skill. Someone had also worked very hard to seal it. The entrance was blocked by a wall of rough-cut stone mortared with a mixture of concrete and coal dust. It was not a collapse. It was not a natural obstruction. It was deliberate, methodical, and the labor involved, Thomas estimated, had been expensive. He raised his lantern toward the upper corner of the sealed entrance. Beneath a layer of grime, scratched directly into the rock face above the stones, someone had left 4 words. "Do not go north." Thomas stood motionless for a long moment, the weight of the mountain pressing down through hundreds of feet of rock above him. He thought about Pete's words, spoken quietly over cold biscuits 5 days earlier. "You notice they never give us work orders for the North Tunnel." He picked up his tools. He completed his inspection. He said nothing to anyone. That night, for the first time since arriving in Harlan, Thomas did not write to Elenina. He sat at the small desk in his room and stared at the blank page while the fog rolled in from Black Mountain, thick and low, swallowing the street outside his window the way it did every night in Harlan. For words scratched into rock by a hand long gone. Belonging to a man whose name Thomas did not know, whose reasons he could not yet understand. But whose warning Thomas was already certain had been meant to be taken seriously. The walkout. They left Harlan at 4 in the morning on a Sunday in early April, when the town was as quiet as it ever got and the fog lay so thick on the streets that a man could walk from Mrs. Combs's boarding house to the end of Mound Street without being seen from 20 feet away. Thomas carried a lantern wrapped in cloth to dim its light, a notebook, and a small camera, a Kodak Brownie that Ray had borrowed from a photographer friend in town without explaining why. Ray carried a second lantern, unlit, and the copied deed language and Dunning's letter folded inside his jacket. They wore dark work clothes and moved without speaking. Pete Sorrell was waiting at the edge of town, at the place where the creek road left Central Street and bent north into the trees. Thomas stopped when he saw him. Pete looked at both of them with those still, winter-water eyes. "I told you to be careful," Pete said. "I didn't say I wouldn't come." Thomas nodded once. The three of them turned north and walked into the dark. The Creek Road. The road to the Dunn property followed the North Creek for most of its 7 miles, rising gradually as the valley narrowed, the creek growing louder as the road climbed and the water compressed between higher banks. The trees on either side were dense second-growth hardwood, the canopy not yet fully leafed but thick enough to block what little pre-dawn light filtered through the overcast sky. Pete walked ahead. He knew this road. He had walked parts of it as a boy, when the Dunn family still employed seasonal workers on the property and a young man could earn $1 carrying fence posts or clearing brush. That had ended before he turned 20. The family had stopped using outside labor sometime around 1895, transitioning entirely to workers who lived on the property and who, as far as Pete could determine, had no social contact with Harlan proper. "How many people on the property now?" Ray asked quietly. 3, maybe 4, Pete said. "Robert Dunn's son Martin manages it, unmarried. 2 hired men who've been there as long as I can remember. They come to town for supplies on the first Saturday of every month. Regular as a clock." "Today is Sunday," Thomas said. "They were in town yesterday," Pete confirmed. "They'll be back on the property by now. But Sunday mornings, Martin drives to the Baptist church in Cumberland, about 12 miles. Leaves at 7. The hired men don't go. So we have a window," Ray said. "We have a window," Pete said. "If we're on the property and clear before 7. Thomas checked his watch in the dim light. 4:42. They walked faster. First light on the Dunn property. The stone building appeared before the house did. It sat close to the creek, perhaps 30 yards from the water's edge, half hidden by a stand of white pines that had been deliberately planted in a deliberate arrangement to screen it from the road. It was built of the same gray limestone that composed the deeper formations of Black Mountain, the blocks cut and fitted with a precision that spoke of skilled masonry and significant expense. The roof was slate. The single door set into the south wall was heavy oak reinforced with iron straps, secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist. There were no windows. Pete studied the padlock for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a short pry bar. Thomas looked at him. 31 years working for men who got rich off this mountain, Pete said quietly. "I think I'm owed a look." The padlock hasp was old iron, exposed to 60 years of creek weather. Pete worked at it methodically, and after 4 minutes of careful leverage, the hasp pulled free of the doorframe with a sound like a single knock on hollow wood. The door swung inward. What was inside? The smell reached them before the light did, dry and mineral and very old. The smell of stone and something else beneath it that Thomas could not immediately name. It reminded him distantly of the deep sections of Shaft 4, but cleaner, as though whatever produced it had been sealed away from the mine's particular dampness and had preserved itself in the still air. Pete uncovered his lantern. Ray lit the second. The building was a single room, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a stone floor and a vaulted ceiling rising to about 12 feet at its peak. Along both long walls, built-in wooden shelving ran from floor to ceiling, interrupted at regular intervals by wooden support posts. The shelving was filled with objects arranged with methodical care, not stacked randomly, but organized, catalogued, with small handwritten labels attached to each item or group. Thomas moved to the nearest shelf and held his lantern close. Black Mountain, North Chamber A, Level 3, 1887. The object beside the label was a stone tool, a hand axe, roughly shaped, dark with age. Beside it, wrapped in cloth gone stiff with time, was something flat and rectangular that Thomas carefully unfolded to reveal a piece of prepared hide covered in markings, systematic markings, rows of symbols repeated and varied in patterns that suggested Thomas was not an educated man in the academic sense, but he had a farmer's practical intelligence and a miner's observational precision that suggested language. Or something that functioned like language. He looked down the shelf. There were dozens of objects. Hundreds. He looked at the opposite wall. More shelving, more objects, more labels. Chamber A, Level 2, 1891. Chamber B, Level 1, 1894. Chamber B, Level 3, 1903. Ray was moving along the far wall, lantern raised, reading labels in a rapid undertone. "These go back to 1847, Ray said. "The earliest label I can find. 1847, that's when Elias Holbrook first acquired the mineral rights. They've been removing material from those chambers for 76 years, Thomas said. Systematically, Pete said. He was standing in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in with the quiet comprehension of a man who has suspected something for a long time and is now watching the suspicion become fact. They didn't stumble onto this. They knew what was here. They've been managing it. Thomas moved deeper into the room. Near the back wall, the shelving gave way to a large flat table. On the table were stacked 6 ledger books, bound in dark cloth, labeled by year. The earliest dated 1851. The most recent, 1921. Thomas opened the 1908 ledger. The entries were in a careful, formal hand, the hand of someone who understood that what they were recording had significance, and who wanted the record to be precise. Each entry listed a date, a location within the chamber system, a description of the item removed, and its condition. The descriptions were careful and largely technical. Stone implement, bifacial, approximately 8 inches. Excellent condition. Prepared surface with systematic markings. Hide substrate, fragile. Structural timber fragment, fire-hardened, with carved notations. Thomas turned pages. February 1908. The entries grew more frequent, multiple removals per week, as though someone had accelerated the pace of extraction. Then March 4, 1908. A single entry, in a different hand. Darker ink, the letters pressed harder into the page, the way a man writes when his hand is not entirely steady. Shaft 7, North Section crew reached Chamber B lower access point. Crew leader informed and work suspended pending family consultation. Decision reached March 6, Standard Protocol. Entry sealed March 7, Standard Protocol. Thomas stared at those 2 words for a long time. "Ray," he said. Ray came to the table. Thomas pointed to the entry. Ray read it. His face in the lamplight went very still. "Standard Protocol," Ray said. 11 men died on March 12, 1908, Thomas said. 5 days after the entry was sealed. The 3 of them stood around the table in silence. Outside, the creek moved over its stones in the dark, indifferent and continuous. The photographs. Ray uncovered the Brownie camera. Thomas held both lanterns at angles that maximized the available light while Ray photographed the ledger entries, the 1908 page specifically, and several others showing the systematic nature of the operation stretching back decades. He photographed the shelving, the labels, the artifacts. He used the entire roll of film, working methodically, moving through the room with the focused efficiency of a man who understands he has one chance and limited time. Pete stood at the door, watching the approach road. When Ray finished, Thomas carefully replaced the ledger exactly as he had found it. He confirmed that nothing had been moved or disturbed. They backed out of the building. Pete reset the hasp as well as could be managed, not locked, but positioned to appear locked from a distance. Thomas checked his watch. 6:21. We need to move, Pete said. They moved. The walk back. They were 2 miles down the creek road, moving quickly in the strengthening gray light of early morning, when Pete spoke. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. Not to either of them specifically, to the situation itself. Miss Alma said send copies to institutions the families can't reach, Ray said. Universities. A federal archive. The photographs, the copied deed language, Dunning's letter, packaged together, sent simultaneously to multiple locations, so that suppressing one copy doesn't suppress all of them. That protects the information, Pete said. It doesn't protect you. No, Ray agreed. The moment those photographs reach anyone outside this county, the families will know someone was on that property, Pete said. They'll know it was someone with access to information about the 1908 event and the deed records. That narrows the field considerably. Then we need to be gone before the photographs arrive, Thomas said. Both men looked at him. I was planning to bring Elenina and Ruth here in the summer, Thomas said. He looked at the road ahead, the creek on his left, the mountain visible now above the tree-line, its upper ridges dissolving into cloud. I'm going to write to Elenina today. Tell her to go to my brother James. I'll send the photographs and the documents to 3 separate addresses, the State University in Lexington, a federal archive in Washington, and a newspaper editor in Cincinnati that Ray knows. And then? Ray asked. And then I finish the week's work, Thomas said. Collect my pay on Friday. And on Saturday morning, I'm on the first train out of Harlan. They may move before Saturday, Pete said. They may, Thomas acknowledged. That's the risk. Pete was quiet for a moment. I have a sister in Corbin, Pete said. I've been meaning to visit her. Thomas looked at him. I think I'll go on Saturday as well, Pete said. The 3 of them walked in silence for a while. The creek beside them. The mountain behind them. Harlan somewhere ahead in the fog. Those people in those chambers, Ray said eventually. Whoever they were. Centuries of occupation, Dunning said. Artifacts, records, a whole system of knowledge stored in stone. Yes, Thomas said. And 4 families spent 76 years removing it piece by piece and locking it in a stone building on a private creek, Ray said. Not studying it, not reporting it. Just keeping it. Keeping it from becoming public, Pete said. Which is a different thing. Public knowledge means government interest. Government interest means loss of control over the property. Loss of control over the property means loss of the mineral rights. They buried the history of whoever lived in that mountain, Ray said. To protect a coal lease. No one answered. There was nothing to add. They walked into Harlan as the first church bells of Sunday morning began to ring, the sound traveling flat and clear through the fog from the bell tower on Central Street, and the town around them stirred slowly into its day, unaware of what 3 men had seen on the North Creek before the light came up. The packets. Ray had developed the film Sunday night in the darkroom of his photographer friend, a man named Curtis Webb, who asked no questions, accepted $2, and delivered 12 prints by 10 o'clock. Ray divided them into 3 packets. Each contained prints of the critical ledger entries, the shelf labels, and the room's overall layout, along with a typed summary of the deed language, Dunning's letter, and the documented sequence leading from the 1906 survey to the 1908 explosion. The first packet went to Professor Edmund Hargrove at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, a historian whose published work on Appalachian settlement Ray had read and respected. The second went to the National Archives in Washington, addressed to the Office of the Federal Records Administrator, with a cover letter identifying the material as evidence potentially relevant to a federal mine safety inquiry. The third went to Walter Crane, editor of the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune, with whom Ray had corresponded twice before on unrelated matters, and whose reputation for printing difficult stories was, Ray believed, genuine. Thomas mailed a letter to Elenina the same morning. "Go to James," he wrote. "Don't wait for another letter. Go now. I will explain everything when I see you. I am well and I am being careful. Go to James." He did not explain. There wasn't enough time, and an explanation in a letter felt like a risk he wasn't willing to take. The week. Monday through Thursday passed with a surface normality that Thomas found more unsettling than open hostility would have been. The mine operated. The crew worked. Walt Gregg gave his orders in the same flat voice he always used. Junior Bates was cheerful. Odell Maynard was taciturn. Calvin Price worked with his characteristic precision and said little. Pete worked alongside them with the same unhurried steadiness he always brought to the job, and Thomas watched him and understood what it cost, the effort of behaving like a man with nothing on his mind when a man's mind was full. Ray went to work. Ray ate at the boarding house. Ray read in the evenings and said nothing unusual to anyone. But on Wednesday evening, something shifted. Thomas noticed it first at dinner. Mrs. Combs's usual table, 6 boarders, the smell of fried chicken and cornbread. The conversation was ordinary, except for one moment when Harmon Blevins, a surface worker who had lived at the boarding house for 3 years, mentioned that he'd seen Martin Dunn in town. "Thought he only came in on the first Saturday," someone said. "Usually," Harmon said. And left it there. Thomas kept his face neutral. He finished his dinner. He went to his room and sat at the desk and wrote nothing. Martin Dunn was in Harlan on a Wednesday. The first Saturday had been 6 days ago. There was no reason for Martin Dunn to be in Harlan on a Wednesday unless something had changed. Thomas thought about the hasp on the stone building's door. Pete had reset it as well as could be managed, but as well as could be managed was not the same as undetectable to a man who checked it regularly. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling and calculated the distance from Monday morning to Saturday morning and decided the distance was no longer acceptable. Thursday. Thomas found Ray at breakfast and said, low and direct, "Martin Dunn was in town yesterday." Ray set down his coffee cup. "How certain are you?" Harmon Blevins mentioned it. "No reason to lie." "The hasp," Ray said. "Possibly. Or one of the ledgers, if they checked the building regularly and noticed." The photographs took time. The lamp angles, the movement through the room. "We were careful," Ray said. "We were careful for men who had never done this before," Thomas said. "I don't know how careful that is against men who have been managing the secret for 70 years. Ray thought for a moment. "The packets are already sent. They arrive or they don't. Nothing we do now changes that." "No," Thomas agreed. "But we can change when we leave." "I can be on the afternoon train today," Ray said immediately. The absence of hesitation told Thomas that Ray had already been thinking about this. "Pete," Thomas said. "I'll tell him before shift," Ray said. "And you?" Ray looked at him steadily. Thomas looked at his plate. "I need to collect pay Friday morning, not Friday evening. I'll go to the paymaster before shift and tell them I have a family emergency. They'll dock me half a day. I don't care." "That puts you on the Friday afternoon train." "Yes." Ray looked at him steadily. "Thomas." "I know," Thomas said. "I'll be on it." Thursday afternoon, Ray left on the 2:15 train to Corbin, from where he would connect to Lexington. He shook Thomas's hand on the boarding house porch with the grip of a man who is not certain he will shake that hand again and wants the gesture to count. "If Hargrove gets that packet," Ray said, "this doesn't stay quiet. A historian at a state university with documented evidence of suppressed archaeological sites and a mine disaster cover-up, that becomes a story. If he gets it, Thomas said. He'll get it, Ray said. I addressed it to his university office and his home address both. The families can't intercept mail at two separate addresses without someone noticing. Thomas nodded. Go, Thomas said. Ray went. Thomas watched the train pull away from the Harlan station until it disappeared around the ridge. Then he walked back to the boarding house through the afternoon fog and began packing his canvas bag. Thursday evening. Pete came to Thomas's room at 7 o'clock. He knocked twice, quietly, and Thomas let him in. Pete looked at the half-packed bag on the bed and nodded, as though confirming something he already knew. Martin Dunn went to the sheriff's office this afternoon, Pete said. I saw him go in. I watched from across the street. He was inside for 40 minutes. Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed. The sheriff, Thomas said. Lon Combs. Distant cousin to your landlady, no connection otherwise. He's been sheriff for 11 years. He is not a dishonest man in the ordinary sense. He doesn't steal, he doesn't fabricate evidence, but he understands where the weight in this county lies. And he has never, in 11 years, done anything to shift it. What do you think Dunn told him? I think Dunn told him that someone entered his property without authorization and disturbed materials in his storage building, Pete said. Which is accurate. I think he may have told him who he suspects, which may also be accurate, depending on how carefully they've been watching. Thomas was quiet. I'm leaving on the first train tomorrow, he said. 6:15. Before the paymaster opens. The money, Pete said. Doesn't matter, Thomas said. He surprised himself with how clearly he meant it. A week's wages did not matter. Elalina and Ruth in Wise County with his brother James, that mattered. The packets in the mail, that mattered. Getting on a train before Lon Combs developed a specific reason to find him, that mattered. The money did not matter. I'll be on the 6:15 as well, Pete said. He was already at the door. You don't have to. I know I don't, Pete said. 6 o'clock. Platform. Before dawn. Thomas did not sleep. He finished packing, 12 minutes, and then sat in the chair by the window and watched the fog on Mound Street and thought about everything that had happened in the 7 weeks since he had stepped off the Louisville and Nashville Railroad car with $11 and a canvas bag. He thought about the sealed passage in Shaft 4, and the 4 words above the stone wall. He thought about Pete's uncle, sick with influenza the week 11 men died. He thought about Foster Dunning, who had made the practical choice and spent the rest of his life writing letters about it. He thought about Miss Alma Pig, 71 years old, keeping a 15-year-old secret alive in a house full of newspapers because she believed someone would eventually come who could do something with it. He thought about the stone building on the North Creek, and the shelves running floor to ceiling, and the ledger entries in their careful formal hand. 76 years of systematic removal from chambers that had held human knowledge for centuries. Tools and prepared hides and systematic markings that functioned like language, arranged on shelves with paper labels, locked behind an iron-strap door, kept from the world so that 4 families could maintain a coal lease on a mountain. He thought about the people who had lived in those chambers. Who they had been. What they had known. What they had tried to preserve. He thought about how history worked, how much of it depended on who controlled what was written down, what was labeled, what was locked away, what was sent on a train to a historian in Lexington or buried in a stone building on a private creek. At 5:30, he put on his jacket, picked up his bag, and looked around the small room one last time. The desk where he had written letters to Elalina. The lamp. The photograph. He took the photograph of Elalina and Ruth from the desk and put it in his jacket pocket, close to Foster Dunning's letter, which he had carried there since Sunday. He went downstairs quietly, left $2 on the kitchen table for Mrs. Combs, more than he owed, which felt right, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark. The platform. Pete was already there. A dark shape at the far end of the platform, his bag at his feet, looking north up the track. The fog was heavy, and the platform lamps made yellow circles in the gray that illuminated almost nothing. Thomas walked to where Pete stood. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, and men who have worked underground together for weeks develop a comfort with shared silence that other friendships take years to reach. At 6:08, Thomas heard footsteps on the platform behind them. He turned. Sheriff Lon Combs walked toward them from the station house end of the platform. He was a tall man, unhurried, wearing his coat against the cold. He had a deputy with him, young, hanging slightly back, uncertain of his role in whatever this was. Combs stopped 6 feet from Thomas and looked at him with the measuring expression of a man who has been given information and is comparing it against what he sees. "Thomas Aldridge," Combs said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "You work Shaft 4 at the Consolidated?" "I do." Combs looked at the bag. "Going somewhere?" "Family emergency," Thomas said. "My wife. I got a letter." Combs considered this. "Martin Dunn tells me someone entered his property Sunday morning, his storage facility on the North Creek." "I don't know anything about that," Thomas said. The fog moved between the platform lamps in slow drifts. The track stretched away to the north, disappearing into gray. Combs looked at Thomas for a long moment. He was, as Pete had said, not a dishonest man in the ordinary sense. He was a man who understood weight and where it lay. He was also, Thomas now saw, a man who was not entirely comfortable with what he had been asked to do on a cold Friday morning at a train platform. "The Dunn family," Combs said slowly, "has been in this county since before my father was born. They are significant people." "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "They have asked me to look into this matter," Combs said. "I understand," Thomas said. Another pause. In the distance, the sound of the train, still several minutes out, moving through the mountain gap to the north. "Your wife," Combs said. "She in Harlan?" "No, sir. Wise County, Virginia." "You got family there?" "Brother," Thomas said. "James Aldridge. I'm going to his place." Combs looked at him. At the bag. At Pete, who had not moved or spoken. "I don't have cause to hold you," Combs said. The words were careful and deliberate, chosen with a precision that told Thomas they were not accidental. "A man can travel." "Thank you, Sheriff," Thomas said. Combs nodded once. He looked at both of them for another moment, then turned and walked back toward the station house. The deputy followed, glancing back once over his shoulder. Thomas breathed. The train. The 6:15 came in on time, its headlamp cutting a tunnel through the fog, the brakes groaning against the cold rails as it slowed into the station. Thomas and Pete were the only passengers boarding at Harlan. Thomas chose a window seat on the west side of the car, away from the platform. He set his bag on the rack above, sat down, and looked out the window at the platform where Sheriff Combs stood with his deputy, watching the train without expression. The train began to move. Harlan's buildings slid past the window. The brick storefronts of Central Street. The steeple of the church whose bells he had listened to on Sunday morning, returning from the North Creek. The coal company's office at the corner of Central and Mine. The boarding house on Mound Street, where $2 sat on Mrs. Combs's kitchen table. And then the buildings ended, and there was only the mountain. Black Mountain, rising above the trees to the east, its summit hidden in cloud, the way it always was, the way it had been every morning Thomas had spent in Harlan. He looked at it until the track curved and it disappeared from his window. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched Foster Dunning's letter. Then he took out the photograph of Evelina and Ruth and held it in his lap and looked at it in the gray morning light coming through the window. Pete sat across the aisle, looking forward, his hands on his knees. The train moved north through the fog, through the gap in the mountains, away from Harlan County and its coal and its 4 families and its stone building on the North Creek, carrying 2 men and everything they knew toward whatever came next. What came next? Professor Edmund Hargrove received the packet on Wednesday of the following week. He read it in his office at the University of Kentucky, read it again, and then sat for a long time with it on his desk before picking up the telephone. The Cincinnati Commercial Tribune published a partial account 6 weeks later, citing documentary evidence and named sources, among them a letter from a deceased surveyor and deed language drawn from public county records. The story was careful and factual. It named the 4 families. It described the 1908 explosion and its timing in relation to the mine crew's proximity to the northern chambers. The Federal Archive acknowledged receipt of the materials in a letter dated May 3, 1923. The Consolidated Black Mountain Coal Company issued no public statement. The Holbrook, Warfield, Cordell, and Dunn families issued no public statement. The Harlan County Sheriff's Office opened no formal investigation. But the materials were in the archive. They were in the university library. They were in the newspaper's records. They existed in multiple places simultaneously. And the thing about evidence that exists in multiple places simultaneously is that it cannot be unmade. It can be ignored, disputed, minimized, buried under the weight of more powerful interests, but it cannot be unmade. Thomas Aldridge arrived in Wise County, Virginia on a Friday evening in April 1923. He walked from the train station to his brother James's house through the last light of a clear spring afternoon, and Evelina met him at the gate. He held her and Ruth for a long time without speaking. And when he finally let go, and they went inside, he sat at James's kitchen table and told Evelina everything. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Those people," she said. "The ones who lived in those chambers." "Yes," Thomas said. "Do you think anyone will find out who they were now that the documents are out?" Thomas looked at his hands on the table. The calloused hands. The scar across the left palm. "I think someone will try," he said. "That's the most I can say." "Someone will try." Evelina nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, the Virginia spring moved through the trees, and the evening was quiet. The mountains in the distance were a soft blue-gray in the fading light, gentler than the mountains of Kentucky, less hidden in fog, their shapes clear and readable against the sky. Thomas looked at them for a long time. He thought about Black Mountain. About the north tunnel sealed behind mortared stone. About the chambers below the Dunn property on the North Creek, emptied piece by piece over 76 years, the objects now sitting on shelves in a locked room with paper labels in a careful hand. About the people who had put those objects in the mountain in the first place, who had prepared those surfaces and made those markings and built those chambers and lived in the darkness long before any Holbrook or Warfield or Cordell or Dunn had ever set foot in eastern Kentucky. Their names were not known. Their language had not been translated. Their history had been removed from its context and locked in a room and guarded at the cost of 11 men's lives. But it existed. The objects existed. The photographs existed. The ledgers existed, sitting on a shelf in a stone building on the North Creek, waiting for a world that might eventually be willing to ask the right questions. Thomas did not know if that world would come in his lifetime. He suspected it would not. But it would come. History moved slowly, and against resistance, and at great cost. But it moved. And the things that had been hidden inside Black Mountain for centuries had survived everything that had been done to suppress them, the locked doors, the sealed shafts, the morning in March when 11 men went to work and did not come home. They had survived. That, Thomas thought, was the most important thing. Not justice, not yet. Justice was a longer road than one man's life. But survival. Evidence. The raw material from which, someday, someone would build the truth. He turned away from the window. Elenina was making coffee. Ruth was at the table with a school book, her head bent over the page, her finger tracing the words. Thomas watched his daughter read. Outside, the mountains held their shape against the darkening sky, patient and indifferent and permanent, the way mountains always are. Keeping their own time. Answering to no family, no company, no sheriff, no lease. Keeping what they kept. Remembering what they remembered.